Hey everybody, welcome to the channel, True Crime Stories. If you're new to the channel, please hit that like button and subscribe so you can hear more. Thanks for stopping by. On Halloween 1957, Peter Fabiano and his wife Betty were winding down their night at their Los Angeles home at around 11 p.m. before heading to bed. When the doorbell rang for the final time that night, Peter hesitated to open it. He thought it's a little late for trick-or-treaters. He opened the door and he said, "Isn't it a little late for this?" And the response from a dark figure wearing a mask pointed a firearm in Peter's direction and said no. And without another word, the figure fired a shot into Peter's chest. He turned and escaped from the scene, leaving Peter mortally wounded on the front porch. Betty hurried to her husband's side and attempted to provide aid, but it was too late. Peter was gone. The medical examiner said that Peter died instantly. Betty was left on the porch waiting for authorities to arrive and wondering why anyone would have done this. Now, Peter was known as a gentle individual in the community. He was well liked, and the sudden death left not only Betty in disbelief, but it sent shockwaves throughout the entire neighborhood. Now, everyone had just been celebrating Halloween hours earlier, and then all of a sudden, they're hit with this news that someone was shot and killed by someone who just showed up at their door. Questions arose about whether Peter was a random victim of violence or if he was targeted. The initial investigation by the Los Angeles Police Department yielded no suspects. Friends and neighbors were left baffled. Theories floated around ranging from a Halloween prank gone wrong to an attempted robbery. But Betty, being in the home, says there was no attempted robbery. The person didn't enter the home. Peter opened the door thinking it was going to be some pranksters out trick-or-treating late, maybe some kids who were lagging behind or, something like that. And then he was just shot very quickly after opening the door. There was no robbery. Investigators put together as much as they could about the incident, and clues began to emerge that led authorities to believe that Peter's murder was a targeted attack and not just a random case of violence. As with most investigations, detectives tend to focus first on the closest family members, meaning the wife or anyone else who was close to this person. The goal of the investigator is to learn as much as they can about the victims and their closest family members, beginning with interviews. Now, a suspect did emerge. Authorities then cast a wider net, focusing their investigation on Peter's current and past friends and work associates. And then a moment came when they spoke with a woman named Joan Rabel. Now, she was a photographer who had a friendship with Betty, Peter's wife. Joan's relationship with the family began. It raised no suspicions among investigators. However, something didn't feel right. And with a little urging from Betty, detectives began to look a little closer into Joan's background. It was during this investigation that they found that Joan lived a life of envy and deceit. We expect ghosts, goblins, and ghouls to roam the street on Halloween, but we don't expect a murder. 35-year-old Peter Fabiano, his wife Betty, and teenage stepdaughter Judy Solomon had just retired for the night. Peter's stepson Richard had left a little earlier to return to his Navy base in San Diego. The family wasn't expecting any callers when the doorbell rang after 11 p.m. Peter went to the door. Betty said she heard him say yes, and then he said, "Isn't it a little late to be trick-or-treating?" And she heard another voice. She said she heard a noise that sounded just like a pop. And her daughter Judy both ran out of their rooms, ran down toward the door to find out what was going on. This was when she ran to the door and she found her husband laying on his back just inside the door. Judy ran 2 doors down to a neighbor's home and banged on the door until the man came to the door. Now, this man was a member of the Los Angeles Police Department, and he called the office and told them what the girl had told him, and they sent officers out within minutes. Peter was then transported to the Sun Valley Hospital, and he died from massive bleeding. Detectives found no shells at the scene, nor did they find evidence that the shooting was part of an attempted robbery. Peter and Betty had been married since 1955, so they'd been married only a couple of years, but together they owned and operated 2 successful beauty shops. She knew of no one who was an enemy to her husband. A 15-year-old boy who was still out in the neighborhood that night says that he saw a car leaving the neighborhood at a high rate of speed. He couldn't describe the car to the officers. He just said that it was odd that the car was driving so quickly out of the neighborhood. Now, police initially thought that this was some type of gang hit, and they wondered if Peter owed money to mobsters or people, maybe he had loan sharks or something like that. But after they began to investigate, they could find nothing. He had a minor record for bookmaking, taking bets in LA's underworld from 1948. So this led them to think maybe he had gotten involved with the wrong people, maybe he owed someone some money. Now, Peter's background was that he was born in Lansing, Michigan. He enlisted in the Marine Corps and served in the Pacific during the war. He was discharged and he moved to Los Angeles. He worked for a while as a bartender, and this is how he met Betty. Nothing about Peter's background suggested that nobody understood why he got into the beauty business. But Betty urged him to study cosmetology using the GI Bill. She told him that he was a natural because he was very handsome and that he would draw in the ladies. They would want to come and get their hair done. This was Los Angeles, and, young starlets and movie stars. There weren't that many male hairstylists or hairdressers. There were barbers, but she told him that he would be a natural for this and that his good looks would draw in the women and that he would be successful with this. So he agreed and he studied. Now the 2 of them became partners in the beauty shop, and they opened a second location after the first beauty shop began to do so well. Now, one thing that kept their marriage from being perfect was that Betty had a friend named Joan Rabel. Now, she was a 40-something-year-old woman, and she was a cosmetics saleswoman. And so she would visit the beauty shops selling cosmetics, and this is how the 2 women became friends. Now, Betty knew Joan before she met and married Peter. There was something about the way they acted towards each other that made Peter uncomfortable. He and Betty would argue about it, and he said he didn't want Joan coming around anymore. Betty told him he had no right to tell her who to be friends with, and she walked out. She stayed gone for nearly a month, but when she returned, she told him that she would no longer allow Joan to come around, that she would end her friendship with Joan. Now, detectives questioned Joan, and she said that she hated Peter, but she didn't hate him enough to kill him. And she said she didn't have a car, and police were convinced the killer had escaped in a car. She told police she had also never touched a gun in her life. When they followed up on Joan's statement, they found out she told the truth about not having a car of her own. However, she neglected to mention that she often borrowed a car, which was an old green sedan, from a male friend of hers, and that she was often seen driving this car. And police believe this could have been the same car that was spotted leaving the scene that night. 6 weeks after Peter's murder, police heard from a woman, a 43-year-old woman named Golden Pizer. She admitted to the slaying and told detectives, "It's a relief to get this off my mind," she said. She told them that a friend of hers had talked her into helping commit this crime, and this friend's name was John Rabel. They had known each other for about 4 years, and she tells police that she and Joan planned the murder for a couple of months. All she ever talked about was Peter Fabiano. Joan described the victim as a vile, evil man who destroyed all the people around him. Joan told her friend, Golden, that she had a deep hatred for Peter. On September the 21st, Golden purchased a .38 special from a gun shop in Pasadena. She told the man behind the counter that she needed the weapon for home protection. A few days later, Joan drove Golden back to the shop where they picked up the gun. Joan paid for the gun, but Golden kept it with her until Halloween night when Joan came to pick it up. Now, Joan picked up Golden that night in this car that she had borrowed from a friend. She tells police that Joan came to her house with some clothing, and they changed into these clothes, which were blue jeans, khaki jackets, hats, eye masks, makeup, and red gloves. She says they got dressed and they drove to Peter's home at around 9 p.m. The women waited until all the lights were out and that there was no one else outside on the streets. Golden says she walked up to the house and rang the doorbell, and when nothing happened, she rang the doorbell again. Fabiano came to the door expecting to see some trick-or-treaters. Instead, he saw Golden. She brought the gun up with both hands and fired. She says, "I ran to the car and Joan drove to Mrs. Barrett's home." Now, this Barrett was was the woman who she had borrowed the car from, named Margaret Barrett. We left the car on the street and we walked back to our own homes. And Joan told Golden to remember that she never saw her that night and to not tell anyone about this. The grand jury returned indictments against both Golden and Joan for Peter's murder. Golden wept as she told the grand jury of the killing. She explained Joan incited her to commit the murder of the man, painting him as a symbol of evil. She described him as just being this really horrible, evil man, possibly putting this idea into this woman's head that he had been abusive to his wife, who was Joan's friend, and was just something that she had to help this woman do. Now, Joan declined to testify. Rather than face trial, on March 11th, 1958, Golden and Joan both pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and were sentenced to 5 years to life in prison. Now, what was the motive here? Why did Joan want Peter to die? Simple, says the prosecutors. Peter stood in the way of Joan's plan to get close to Betty. She hated him for breaking up her friendship and her relationship with Betty. The newspapers alluded to Joan being a lesbian and said that she had a homosexual love for Betty and wanted Betty for herself. Reports described her as being jealous of their marriage, and now at this time, homosexuality was still illegal in California, and they believe this was the reason why Joan accepted the plea deal. The doctor who examined Golden characterized her as a passive person who they described as being putty in the hands of Joan Rabel. They said that the same doctor described Joan as being cunning and crafty and just a type of person who wouldn't stop until she got her way. This writer goes on to say they don't know when Golden left prison. Even though she fired the gun, she was a pawn in this plot. And of course, that doesn't minimize her guilt. But Golden passed away in February of 1998 in Los Angeles. Joan Rabel vanished. This writer says, I could not find a trace of her. Now, her plan robbed Peter of his life and Betty of her husband, and they say that they hoped she spent a long time in prison. Betty went on to continue her career as a hairstylist and went to work at Studio City in 1962. She never remarried, and she died in California in August of 1999. Their daughter Judy, or Betty's daughter Judy, had attended a Halloween party earlier that night, and Peter picked her up. At about 10:30, they arrived back at the home. They had stopped and got some sandwiches and went straight home. After they ate their sandwiches, Peter got ready to go to bed. Now, this is when he was getting ready to go to bed. Betty had already went to the bedroom, and Judy was already in her bedroom, and this is when they heard the doorbell ring. Now, just a few weeks after Peter's murder, police arrested Joan Rabel. She was a freelance photographer who worked part-time at the beauty shop, selling cosmetics. So she would come in and patrons of this beauty shop would come there and she would sell them cosmetics. When she was questioned, she said she had been at home that night, and detectives later were able to blow apart her alibi because they said that she had borrowed a car from a friend that night. And Margaret Barnett, who was the woman that Joan had borrowed the car from, said that she had asked to borrow the car that night. And when she brought the car back, she noticed that there was 37 miles added to the odometer, and she thought, well, that was strange because she had told her she had only went about 4 miles away from from where she had borrowed the car. But she thought that was strange because she had traveled a distance of 37 total miles. Before I move on into the next part of this story, I would just like to remind everybody, if you haven't already, to please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Well, we know she had picked up the car, went over and picked up this other woman, drove to Peter's home, killed him, and then drove the car back to this woman's neighborhood and left it sitting. When detectives questioned Betty about Joan Rabel, she confessed that she and Peter had recently recovered from a rough patch in their relationship, in their marriage. She implicated that the difficulties in their marriage had been the result of her friendship with Joan, and that she and Peter had separated, or she had left the home briefly for about a month, and that she returned home and told Peter that she would end her friendship with Joan. And Betty told police she had not spoken to Joan since she had returned back home. Now, did detectives suspect that maybe Betty was in on this. Maybe Betty and Joan planned this and just got this other woman to be the scapegoat. Now, this led police to say that this was the motive for killing Peter, that Joan knew that if Peter was dead, she could resume her friendship or her relationship with Betty, and Betty would be in a state of mind where she would need a friend. This Golden Pizer says that she was a 43-year-old divorced woman who had known Joan for about 3.5 years. She said they met at a party where Joan was taking pictures. They struck up a conversation and became good friends. So about a year before the murder, Pizer says that Joan had begun starting to talk about Peter and Betty, and that was all she ever talked about. For 3 solid months before the murder, Joan began to tell her about Peter Fabiano. Now, Golden told police that Joan talked for 3 solid months about Peter and how he was abusing Betty, that he was a drug dealer and a gambler, and that he was taking Betty's money. She described him as being evil and said that he threatened to hurt Joan if she ever came back around Betty. And at first, this Golden just told her, go to the police. Go to the police and tell them what this man is doing to his wife. And Joan said no one would believe her. So she began to put this seed into this Golden's mind that we have to do this ourselves. And Golden was a quiet woman. She had no desire to kill this man. She didn't know him. But over the course of weeks, Joan kept at her and kept convincing her that they had to save Betty. So the more Joan talked about it, the more Golden began to dislike Peter, even though she did not know him. And gradually she agreed to go along with the plot that Joan had come up with. She said they debated over different methods to kill him, and eventually they decided that shooting him on Halloween night would work because people would just think that it was some kind of a Halloween prank gone wrong. Golden says after she shot Peter in the chest, she ran to the car, and Joan was sitting in the car waiting for her. She says that Joan kissed her and thanked her for killing Peter. So now, did she have a relationship with this Joan as well? Were the two of them in a relationship? They returned the car back to the neighborhood, parked it outside the house, and walked away. They did leave behind one of the jackets in the car. And the next day, Golden burned the clothing that she had been wearing that night. A few days after that, she put the gun in a storage locker in downtown Los Angeles. Police were able to find the gun using Golden's directions. She told them that she had not touched the gun since that night and that she had taken it directly to that storage unit. And they were able to prove that it was the same gun that had killed Peter. She told police that she'd always been the kind of person to help her friends and that Joan was her friend. She went on to say that she had urged Joan to contact the police, but she never had. She told her, if you're really worried about your friend, you need to contact the police and get him away from her. But she come to find out later that the things that Joan had put in her mind about Peter were false, that he was not abusive to Betty, that the only reason that Joan disliked him was because she couldn't be close to Betty anymore, that he stood between them. Now, Betty was interviewed and was asked questions about Joan, and she told police that Joan was a cold, cruel person who had no heart. She believed that Joan saw herself as better than everyone, and that she tried to convince her of what a horrible person her husband was, but Betty returned to him anyway, saying that those things were not true, and that she began to see Joan through the same scope as Peter, Peter described her as just being this troublemaker in their marriage, and she began to see it for herself. Now, Pizer was eventually released from prison, and she lived a quiet life. She lived the rest of her life in Los Angeles and died at the age of 83. Now, as for Joan Rabel, her whereabouts were unknown. When she was released from prison, people believe she changed her name because they could not really find any traces of her after she would have been released from prison. I'm sure the prison system has records of that, but the writer was unable to find anything about it. Now, people believe that Joan and Golden were lesbians, and that this was the reason why Golden was so easily convinced by Joan. And a lot of people believe Betty was also involved in a personal relationship with Joan as well. But at that time, it was illegal. Being openly gay in Los Angeles in the 1950s was far from normal. People who were gay kept it hidden. They didn't talk about it. They were ostracized and sometimes even openly harassed by people in society. And so Betty Fabiano very well may have been attracted to Joan. She may have had a relationship with her, but she wanted to live the life of a normal married wife, and so she was with Peter. And then again, a lot of people say Betty was not that way, and that she discovered that her friend Joan had a different attraction to her other than friendship, and that she just told her she didn't want that type of relationship. And this is when Joan became upset and blamed Peter. She believed that if Peter was out of the picture, then Betty would be lured into a relationship with her. So one theory is that Peter found out that Betty and Joan were doing more than friendship and makeup, and that he became angry and confronted Joan to leave his wife alone. There were also people who wondered if maybe Peter himself was also gay, and being that he was a male hair stylist in the 1950s, this was somewhat rare at that time. Even though it was Los Angeles, it was still rare, and a lot of people wondered if maybe he was gay. They said that he often did his own wife's hair. He did Betty's hair. And some people wondered if maybe they had this open secret, but this secret between them, that they were both gay and that they were married, so that they could hide that fact. And some people wondered about that and wondered if maybe when Betty had left, that she had been with Joan and decided to return to her home. Joan is hurt. The theory is Joan was hurt after Betty had left Peter and returned back to Peter. She was hurt. She saw the relationship. People believe she was in love with Betty and that she wanted Betty for herself. And so when she returned back to her husband, this is when she turned to Golden. And people believe that she and Joan were in a relationship. And this is why. But see, this part right here doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because this Golden, if she was attracted to Joan and she was in a relationship with Joan, and all Joan ever wants to talk about is Betty and getting Betty away from her husband, Wouldn't that have made Golden think, well, the moment she's free, she's going to get back together with Joan and I'm going to be left in the dust? I don't know, but a lot, the theories are still out there. A lot of people believe that some people believe Betty may have known about it, may have been in on this plot to kill her husband. But there was nothing to say that, and Joan nor Golden ever indicated that Betty was in any way involved. And so that's pretty much how the story ends. Nobody was ever able to pin down Joan after she left prison. This case has become known as the trick-or-treat slaying. It gripped the nation even more so when the arrest was made on November the 12th. Joan Rabel was a 40-something-year-old Hollywood divorcee and a native of Lithuania. She was a freelance photographer and had once worked at the beauty salon owned by Peter and his wife. Investigators connected Joan to the murder during routine interviews. She described Peter and Betty as two of her closest friends. Now, we all know that Peter wasn't her close friend. He did not like her. And she hated him, according to other people. So this Joan Rabel remains a mystery as to what happened to her after she was released from prison. And I couldn't even find anything to say when she was released from prison. This woman, this Golden Pizer, she broke very easily. She felt so much remorse, and she probably, in my personal opinion, the moment this murder was committed and they returned this car back to the neighborhood and they went their separate ways, she probably never heard from this woman ever again. And she possibly was in love with this woman, or at least attracted to her, and wanted, was thinking that they were going to be together, or at least that she was going to stay in contact with her. And the moment the murder happened and they returned the car, she told her, "Don't ever mention my name to anyone and forget that you know me." So that should have told this Golden right then that she had been used. I think she realized she had been used for this crime. And that was probably what led her to come forward, because she just couldn't live with the fact that she had murdered a man, been talked into helping commit this murder. And had she not mentioned Joan's name, she very well may have went to prison for this murder, and Joan may have walked free. Thanks for watching.